Hello everyone, welcome to the Cultivation Cast by Black Dog Horticulture Technologies and Consulting. I'm Noah Miller, I'm here with Kevin Frender, my partner, and he is our Chief Science Officer and really appropriate to have with us today because we're here to talk about some really cool research. So please stick with us, it's going to be fascinating. It's some of the most interesting research we've seen come across our desks in a while. But before we dive in, just to remind you, please feel free to shoot us ideas, things you want to see us cover, anyone you want us to see, anyone you want us to interview. We'd love to hear about that. You can hit us up through our website help desk or go ahead and send an email to podcast@blackdogled.com. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. What we're here to talk about is there was a recent study out of the Netherlands, Dutch study, and we're going to right away credit the authors because they did a great job. And they even put it in the Creative Commons so we can talk about it and share it with you. We just want to make sure and credit them. I'm going to butcher most of these names because I'm American. So Maximilian, Holweg, Kaiser, Kappers, and Heuvelink, as well as Marcelis. Those are the study authors. And really, if you're watching this, guys, thank you so much. Really interesting study. Loved reading all of it. So the reason we're talking about this, there's a lot of research about LED lights in general, horticulture and all that. This is a nice meeting of two topics that are close to us, cannabis and as well as LED lights. And specifically, what I would call a more complex spectrum than we're seeing generally sold today in the world. Most, I'd say, I'd venture to guess 99% of the LED grow lights sold today are going to be a white, maybe two different whites at the most, and then one red thrown in to boost the red so they get good flowering. That's 99% of them. Yeah, the housings are different. Yes, the names are different. But if you look at the LEDs they're using, most of them are using the same white Samsungs and such, and they're throwing all that in. It's very standard at this point. Now, if you know Black Dog, you know that we take a very different approach. When Kevin developed our spectrum, it is completely different than that. It is not just whites with the red thrown in. We are targeting peaks, and that's important. That's what we're going to talk about today is why do we target peaks, and specifically what does this research really suss out, because it is the best I think we've seen in this. Now, that doesn't mean it's perfect. No research is. There's things that we're salivating. We'd love to see these guys research more into, but it is really fascinating, and they did some things I've personally never seen before. We've talked about when we did a lot of internal research on our spectrum, one of the things we always wanted to report on was density, because we do know our lights grow a denser flower. They even attempted to quantify that, which is really interesting to see in a study because they're looking at yield as well as potency and density. And as we all know in the cannabis space, yield and potency matter, but bag appeal and the quality look of the flower matters. So they're really encompassing all of those things that matter to a cannabis grower. So we should probably start with just a brief outline of the study. And Kim, why don't you lay out what they attempted and did a fairly good job of accomplishing with the study in terms of what they looked at?
Yeah, so they tried to keep all other variables constant in terms of the genetics, the particular strains they were using. They were cloning off the same mother plants, trying to keep everything as constant as possible, which is really the only way you can do a study like this realistically and get relevant, meaningful results out of it. So basically they were looking at 8 different treatments, 4 different spectrums of light, as well as 2 different intensity levels, a 600 ppfd and a 1200 ppfd intensity level for each of the 4 different spectra. And the spectra they were using are basically 2 different shades of white light. If you look at physics, there is no such thing as white light. White light is a combination of all sorts of different wavelengths of light that our human eyes perceive as white. So they were using 2 different kinds of white light, the slightly different ratios of green to red to blue, as well as testing out a white LED with a 660 nanometer red LED added. So that adds a 660 nanometer red peak in the spectrum. And then, for the first time I've ever seen anyone do research on this, they also tested a white LED plus the 660 nanometer LED plus a second color of red LED, a 640, what they call 640 nanometer peak LED, which for those of you not intimately familiar with the LED, especially discrete colors of LEDs, it's complicated how they are named, because there's different ways you can look at them and give them different names, all of which are appropriate. But for example, with these particular extra red LEDs they were using, you can look at the spec sheets for the LEDs, and there's what they call a median wavelength, which is the average wavelength of light that it's putting out. There's the peak wavelength, which is where it's putting out the most number of photons at that particular wavelength compared to other wavelengths. And then there's what in the industry is known as the dominant wavelength. And the dominant wavelength is not where it's putting out the most photons. It is how it is perceived by the human eye, what color it looks to be based on the perception of the human eye. So dominant wavelength in this case is about 640 nanometers. You can also find the same LEDs called different things like 630 nanometers. It gets complicated. But the point is they're using a 660 nanometer, which is the peak wavelength, plus a shorter wavelength 640 nanometer red LED. And this is something that is kind of dear to our hearts, because we've had these two colors of red in our spectrum, two distinct red LEDs in our spectrum for the last 14 years that Black Dog LED has been around. And we did it for a very particular reason, and it's nice to see this study come out and vindicate why we did it with yet another independent study showing that, yeah, it increases yield.
So yeah, we will, for those of you listening to this, great. If you happen to be watching it, we will try and put up some of the very fascinating graphs as we're going through it. For example, Kevin was just talking about the spectrum. We will put it up there so you can see all the different mixes that they tested. Also, I would point out that this study is, like we said, it is not perfect. And one other interesting note as manufacturers of LED grow lights, no, you cannot go buy these fixtures. This is a true study. They created their own custom boards to test this out the way they wanted to. Yeah, they used an off-the-shelf housing, but they did definitely create their own board. So you can't go buy this if you're curious, just so you know.
Well, and as a LED light manufacturer, I'd like to point out as well that it's impossible to create a perfect study for studying the spectrum of light that plants use, because there are so many different variables that it gets very complicated. For example, McCree did some work in the last century showing that photosynthetic efficiency peaks in the yellow-orange area of the spectrum, but that was done only looking at one wavelength of light at a time. And even earlier last century, Emerson did a study showing that, hey, if you shine with both red and far red at the same time, which is basically less than 680 nanometers and above 680 nanometers at the same time, you increase photosynthetic efficiency even more. Just that study proves that, hey, looking at one wavelength at a time isn't going to get you the results you really want. And the more wavelengths you throw in there, the more complicated it gets, and it's basically impossible to do this research and point to any one spectrum and say, this is the best, the winner, because there's so many things that get tweaked all the time. So
yeah, and so the McCree sort of proves, for those of you listening and can't grasp that, it's basically a 1 + 1 = 3 scenario.
Emerson.
Yeah, the Emerson effect shows that a 1 + 1 = 3. So you can't, as Kevin said, just measure one. And I would point out that Kevin and I were speaking about this before, and we always want to do research, but having done a fair bit ourselves, it's impossible to test everything. As Kevin was saying, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of usable LEDs out there now that you could use for this from different manufacturers. And if you said, I'm going to create the best grow light and test all of them, the permutations, you couldn't do it in a lifetime, period. So it's taking the research, applying it, and trying to get to the best answer as quickly as possible. And that's what we believe our spectrum does, and why we like this study, because it is, as Kevin said, sort of proving out what we've known and what we've shown in our own research. So one of the things the study shows that targeting particular wavelengths in the spectrum can increase yield, not just the red to blue ratios, right?
yeah, so even in this study, they refer to the different white LEDs that they're using by the ratio of the number of blue photons, which is 400 to 500 nanometers, to green photons, which is 500 to 600 nanometers, to red photons, which is 600 to 700 nanometers. And again, those bins are arbitrarily defined because, I mean, if you look at a 595 nanometer photon, it does not look green at all to our human eyes. It's definitely yellowish orange. So you have to slice and dice it somehow, but a lot of lighting in the past several decades, especially for grow lighting, has been talked about and put into bins based on color temperature. So whether it's warmer or cooler, whether it has more red compared to blue or more blue compared to red. And this study flat out shows that, okay, even if we have the same ratio of red to green to blue, where the peaks are in that wet red area makes a difference. It actually makes a big difference. And so you can't just say, oh, I need a certain ratio of red to green to blue. That's not good enough. You actually have to look at the actual complete spectrum, the actual peaks of every wavelength, to be able to come to accurate conclusions.
And so to show how complex this gets, I'd ask you, Kevin, if they did the study again, didn't change any of the, and I'm going to throw up air quotes, colors, the wavelengths, right? But they changed the ratios. They might get a completely different outcome with the same light, just again, same humps in the peaks in the same place, but again, different ratios, and that would change it. So without even changing the LEDs, you could have many studies just with these couple LEDs they picked, right? I mean, and you would get potentially different results every time.
Yep, and you can keep the ratio of red to green to blue the same all the time, but just changing where the peaks are in the red makes a difference, as this study points out. So
yeah, so as we said, most companies are doing whites with a red, and
specifically a 660 nanometer red.
And why 660?
Okay, because those are the most efficient visible light LEDs that are available on the market right now. And there's two reasons for that. One is the actual production of the chips themselves. They've gotten very good, and the substrate they use, the particular doping of the silicon chips that they create, has gotten very good. They've done a lot of research into it, and they've made it very efficient. But then there's a pure physical reason as well, which is the longer the wavelength is, the higher the nanometer of the wavelength, the less energy the photon actually has. And therefore, the more photons you can get per watt of electricity or energy that you put in, you can get more of these longer wavelength photons out. So just from a pure physics perspective, even if the LEDs were 100% efficient, which is not physically possible, but even if they were 100% efficient, the 660 nanometer LED is going to get you more photons per watt than a 640 nanometer LED would. So there's reasons why, and we see this as an ongoing trend in the LED grow light industry of people bragging purely about the number of photons per watt that they are putting out. And in fact, for energy rebates and things like that, that is the only number that they seem to care about, even though, as this study shows, actually making a quote-unquote less efficient light actually increases yield. So you get more of what you want out of it by making the light less efficient on paper.
So let me say that again. So this is something we talk about a lot. There are plenty of lights that we know on paper look more efficient than our light in terms of photon count, as Kevin was just explaining. But that does not mean that you're going to get more cannabis or higher quality cannabis with those additional photons. It's just more photons. So while lights, if you should look at the efficiency rate, I'm not saying not to look at that, but it's just one data point. You need to look at a lot more. And this study is showing, as Kevin said, they built a less efficient light, and for the same amount of wattage input, it got more cannabis and higher quality, and we'll talk about that as well. So we always say, a light is on paper, but then there's real world. We all know paper and real world don't always line up. You might think they do, but they don't. And this is a great example of where it didn't really line up. They have a less efficient light, and they even speak to that in the research.
I think it's more a matter of a single metric is not good enough to determine how good a grow light is. Just because it's more efficient and puts out more photons per watt doesn't mean it's a better grow light. Yeah, by any means, this study shows quite the opposite.
And yeah, and as most problems, if you've solved a lot of problems in your life and been around the block a few times, you've learned not to depend on one data point in most cases. Not all, but most cases. So interesting. We can't see the other fascinating thing, and Kevin pointed this out, the human eye is really poor. I see growers look at a light and say, oh, that's a good light, or I like that spectrum or whatever. Just so we're all clear, the human eye is terrible at sussing out these differences. So in this case, they used 2 reds, and to your point, Kevin, the human eye could not really see the difference in those. If I lit them up next to each other, I might, but the light itself.
So if you take the 2 LEDs next to each other, which we actually have on our LED boards, they do look different. The 660 nanometer LED looks just as red. It just doesn't look as bright. And that's because it is further towards the edge of our visual perception. So even though it may be putting out more photons, it doesn't look as bright because our cone cells in our eyes are not as efficient at picking up those longer wavelength red. So the 640 nanometer LEDs that they're talking about, the other red that they added that is not in standard LED grow lights, but has been in ours for 15 years or 14 years now, is typically what they use for taillights in the automotive industry or stoplights for the red stoplights, because it falls very, very close to the peak of our cone cells sensitivity to red light. So it's the best for looking the reddest and the brightest red to us, even though it is not the best at pumping out photons per watt.
But if I shine those 2 reds at a white wall, would I be able to really tell the difference between them readily?
No, our human eyes are incapable. We only have a red, a green, and a blue color receptor in our eyes. And basically, we can't tell the difference between something that is near red and far red unless it starts putting off enough light towards the green area of the spectrum that our green cone cells start getting excited. So basically, once it becomes red enough, we can't tell the difference between near red and mid-red and far red light.
So while Crayola may have brick red and red, we can't really tell the difference in the light. So, okay. So the interesting thing about that is that while we cannot tell the difference, this study shows completely that the plants can tell the difference. It does make a difference. So if you're going to understand light and you're really going to dig into it, you have to get beyond our terrible meters that we have as eyeballs. You really can't tell what you're looking at. You need to dig into the science. And I'd recommend, if you're going to take growing seriously, that you try to educate yourself a little bit on this. So when you're being pitched stuff about light, you actually can kind of understand what they're talking about and start to sniff out the BS in the room, basically. So it's interesting to point out that the human eye's poor, but the plants definitely saw a difference that to us is inconsequential. We can't even tell. So now let's get into the meat of it a little bit. So what were the increases we saw, Kevin? I mean, there's some really interesting data here with regard to yield, quality, density. Let's start with yield. Everybody cares about yield. All the grow light manufacturers really focus on yield. We focus a bit on quality as well, but most just focus on, hey, you can get this much, 10 pounds of our light, or whatever the claim is of the week. So there's a lot of claims around that. What did they see with this study in terms of yield?
So compared to the only white LED spectrum, as well as the white LED plus the 616 nanometer red, they saw increased yield by having the same intensity, the same PPFD for their growth chambers, with the dual red peak spectrum. So the spectrum that has a peak at both 640 and 660 nanometers. In addition, when it comes to quality, they also saw an increase in terpene concentrations for the dual peak red spectrum compared to all the other spectra they tested. However, that increase in terpene concentration they only saw at the higher 1200 ppfd lighting level, indicating that maybe it doesn't make as much of a difference if you're going with 600 ppfd, which, by the way, 600 ppfd is a fairly low light level.
For flowering.
For flowering especially, yes. I mean, we recommend 600 ppfd for veg, and that's when you've got 18 hours a day of light on it. But for flowering, that's fairly low, and for example, we would normally not even recommend supplementing CO2 if you're only running 600 ppfd and you've got decent air exchange.
I mean, even back in the days of single-ended HPS, if you tested a well-lit room with relatively new bulbs, you'd be up closer to 800. So 600 is definitely on the low side. Running 1,000 watt on a 4x4. But so as Kevin said, they saw these increases. And I just want to rattle them off because it's important. We're not talking about one data point with regard to quality. The 2 peaks won for total terpenoid, total cannabinoids, THC, and CBD concentrations across all 4 of those. So terpenes, THC, CBD, all the active compounds they measured came out higher with 2 red peaks. Again, less efficient light. Maybe it doesn't seem to matter, but it beat it out every time across the board. So for all of those data points, it beat it. That as a grower, we are all striving to take the genetics to their fullest potential and get the most out of them. And clearly, the 2 red peaks made a difference here. Now, in terms of yield, that is fascinating that they saw more of an impact at the higher, because more and more people, as we deploy lights, back before it was 800, 900, then 1,000 became kind of the standard that we would deploy in a flower room, and now we're 12 and up to 1,500 in a flower room, and there's research showing even higher. So we're deploying higher light, and what this is starting to show is that as we really try to push those light levels to the metabolic limits of the plant,
Spectrum matters even more.
spectrum's going to get more important. It's just like anything I do. If I do it more intensely, those little nuances start to get teased out. If you do a little exercise, no big deal. But if you're an extreme athlete pushing yourself to the limit, doing something in a different order, or eating before, or having caffeine, those little differences start to come out and become more clear. And as we as an industry evolve, both cannabis and lighting for cannabis, we are pushing the plants harder, we're pushing the plants further, and we believe this stuff is going to matter even more. And there's been other research that started to look at that, higher light levels, reds can do things, but we're going to see more of that, we think, as they start to push the light levels to a whole new level.
And I mean, one thing that's interesting to note in this study is they were only testing 4 different lighting spectra. None of those included the far red 700 nanometer plus 700 to 750 nanometer light that Emerson showed decades ago increases photosynthetic efficiency. So if you consider the 2 red peaks they had, and if you consider 730 to be far red, as it's sometimes called, then realistically having 3 red peaks is probably better than 2.
Yeah. Well, one other thing there, and I'd like to ask you this. So if we really look at that and we look at the 2 peaks, why is it that, or let me ask you this way. If I use, because you just said if I did 730, what if you substituted out one of these, let's say they got rid of one of the red peaks and instead replaced it with that. What do you think would be the outcome there? Again, just one simple change of which there are millions.
Emerson showed back in the 1950s that having photons that were less than 680 nanometers plus photons that were greater than 680 nanometers at the same time gave an increase in photosynthetic efficiency more than just doubling the number of photons less than 680 nanometers. So we would expect an additional increase in photosynthetic efficiency if they added the infrared or near infrared 730 nanometer peak.
And that's what I want to point out is, so these guys are not saying this is the perfect spectrum or the ultimate or the optimized spectrum. They're testing something very specific, which is fascinating. But by no means is this the best or the final say in it. They just happen to test these 2 to start. And I do hope they test other things. But as Kevin pointed out, had they used 2 red peaks, but one of them was a far red instead, they might have gotten an even better result. Don't know, we'll have to wait for them to do the test, but we do believe that. So it's just to point out that this study is true research. They're just wading in and trying things out. They're not trying to say, hey, we've created the best spectrum. No, they don't even imply that in here. And I do encourage everyone watching this to check out the study. We will, everywhere we post this podcast, we'll try to get it in the description. We'll try to get it in the notes of the post wherever we do this, because it is, I really recommend it. It's fascinating stuff to look at and absorb a little bit. One other thing, let's talk about the density, because that was really impressive to me that they went over it. They put the formula in here. Basically what they did is to get the volume of the inflorescence, the flowers, they took the length, and those of you that remember your geometry, it's pi r squared, right? So they took the length times pi, and then they took the width divided by 2 to get the radius, and then they squared it, and now what they're trying to do is figure out the true volume there. And then, of course, they took that against the weight. So they're trying to figure out density. And in that, where they did track density, they had an increase with 2 red peaks. So not only do we get better active compounds, which we'd all argue is a better quality flower, the plant was able to express itself to its more full potential. They got higher yield, but they got better quality, not just in the testing, but if you like, not larvae loose bud, but you like more dense flower, they got better flower too, better quality. So they're ticking the boxes. They got more yield to sell. They got better quality for the metrics that they're going to have to put on there for the numbers they're going to put. There's still plenty of THC shoppers. All their levels went up, including terpenes. And they got better quality, so they're going to get better bag appeal. They checked every box with this study in terms of the 2 red peaks. It made a difference. We're talking real results that would translate to dollars in an operation. And that's important because we are all doing this. If you're a professional grower, not a home grower, you are doing this to make money at the end of the day. You are doing it to be successful and stay in business. This proves that the 2 red peaks could help you stay in business and be more profitable.
And all with a light that looks less impressive, less efficient on paper. It creates fewer photons per watt of electricity.
So the efficiency geeks out there that just look at efficiency of electrical fixtures would say this is an inferior light. But this study would show you you're better off running this than the more efficient light, hands down, all across the board. So really, really fascinating stuff there. So as we said, it's both yield and quality, not one or the other. It's not giving up. We often say, hey, you can have more yield, but then your quality might drop. In this case, they showed an increase across the board. As we said, one of the challenges here is that they couldn't test everything across the board. They can't test all the permutation of the LEDs available on the market. No one could in a lifetime. So there are other things we wish they had done and wish they would do. And we look forward to seeing that. What would you really like to see tested in the future, Kevin?
Well, they're testing 2 particularly targeted red wavelengths here. We've been putting multiple different blue wavelengths into our light for 14 years now as well as ultraviolet. And I mean, there's so many combinations and permutations of these things that you could test. But basically, our light is designed on our experience and testing it versus, hey, if we tweak this or that, do we get better or worse? So we've been selling the spectrum that has been working the best for us for a very long time. And that spectrum has not changed significantly in the last 9 years now. So we found a spectrum that seems to work incredibly well. It out-yields other lights on the market, even though it is less efficient in terms of putting out photons per watt. It increases yield per watt, and that's all that we actually care about. We don't care about how many photons per watt you get out of it. We care about your yield and your quality at the end of the day. So
the reality, not the paper, right? Because paper is just readings. If we really look at it and say the reason, for those of you listening to this that are curious, why is it they're really putting those in there? There's really 2 main reasons to go back to that. One is they are efficient. They're getting those good numbers on paper. Their light looks good on paper. Got it. That's one. I think you understand that at this point. The other thing is financial, right? Every company is going to be chasing profits. So while we haven't changed ours because we haven't chased the cheapest LED spectrum we could put together, we've tried to put together the best spectrum. The cheapest LED markets are the most mass produced with the most research behind them for production. And so they're producing and pumping those out for offices and ballparks and parking lots, all the whites. And as Kevin said, they're using the reds and taillights and such. So there are a lot out there. That drives the cost down. So manufacturers look and say, hey, I can make a fixture that pumps out a lot of photons and looks good on paper, and it's cheap to buy those LEDs. Let me tell you, the LEDs we buy, they're not cheap. Try buying UV LEDs. They cost way more than these white.
And to be completely fair, these lights do grow plants. There's no disputing that. They do grow plants, but this study shows, hey, you can do even better by increasing the number of LEDs you've got in your fixture, the number of different wavelengths of LEDs you've got in your fixture.
Yeah. Love it. We love science, and we love it when science proves what we've been doing for 14 years is on the right path and we're doing the right thing. Again, we'd love to see them study some other things. So again, this one, you could argue, what would you say with a white? It's got a couple humps, a couple peaks. So how many peaks were they, and I'm going to put up air quotes here, how many peaks did they test?
Well, okay, so white LEDs, at least all modern white LEDs that you get on the market, are actually a blue LED with a phosphor coating on top. And the way they make it a warm white LED or a cool white LED is just by adjusting the chemistry or thickness, or sometimes both, of that phosphor coating on top. So the phosphor coating is literally taking blue photons, it's absorbing them, it's stealing some energy from them, and re-releasing a new photon with a lower energy or longer wavelength, shifted towards the green, yellow, orange, or red into the spectrum. And that is making the light appear white to us because it's essentially smearing the blue light that's actually being produced by the LED itself over the entire visual spectrum. And by varying the chemical concentration in the phosphor coating, the ratio of different chemicals they've got in there, as well as the thickness of the coating. You can control how much of the blue light is converted and relatively how much of that blue light gets converted into yellow or orange or red. So there's all sorts of different white LEDs out there now. If you go to your home improvement store, you'll see all sorts of different Kelvin temperature for the lights being offered. And that's basically just a variation on the particular phosphor. So in terms of peaks, it really depends on how you want to define it. Realistically, there's only one peak in a white LED, and that is the underlying blue LED that's shining through the phosphor is going to create a 450 nanometer blue peak. But then there's other humps, but those are much broader because they're being created by this phosphor absorbing and smearing the light out over a wider range of the spectrum. So you can change where the hump is and how tall it is relative to the blue peak. And it gets into a matter of semantics, whether you want to call it peaks or humps but for the most part, you could argue a white LED has at most one or two peaks in it.
So let's say two. Let's give them benefit of the doubt. Let's throw out two. And so here they tested in their more advanced test, the one that won had two reds. So we'll give it 4 peaks. Just for those listening to us and we talk about our spectrum, and again, we'll try and throw ours up on screen as well, and you can certainly find it on our website. We do publish it. How many peaks do we have, Kevin, on ours?
Well, again, if you count the white LEDs, because we do have white LEDs in our fixtures, it's the most efficient way to create green photons is still with these white LEDs. The green LEDs, even the ones that you're using in stoplights now, are not as efficient as a blue LED with a phosphor coating. But if you count the white as 2 humps, then we actually have 9, because we have 8 distinct LEDs that we use in our light, 8 different, 7 discrete wavelengths plus a white LED.
So, okay, so their baseline, their control, we'll say was 3 humps. A white with 2 humps and a red, 3 humps. 4 humps, 4 peaks, did better across all the metrics pretty much, right? At different powers and everything, it won almost across the board 100%.
Based on our experience over the years, we don't pay for and add these other LEDs because we want to pay more for our lights and make them more expensive. We put them in there because it makes them work better. So yeah, it's not necessarily a case of more is always better, but in our experience, I mean, we wouldn't be putting these other discrete colors of LEDs in there just for the hell of it because it costs us money. It's more challenging to engineer it. We have to get more LEDs from more sources. I mean, it makes everything more complicated, but we put them in there because in our experience, it grows better plants.
Yeah, so again, 3 is good, 4 is better, we have 9. So if you want to extrapolate their study out at all and try and say that, you could say that the more peaks, the more targeted LEDs are going to provide, again, better across the board, quality, yield, and the bag appeal also.
At the same point though, I mean, we've been in the LED industry a very long time now, and back when we first started, white LEDs were nowhere near as efficient as they are right now. In fact, they were very inefficient compared to the discrete colors of LEDs. And yeah, 14 years ago, it was a bragging point in the market of, oh, we've got 12 discrete wavelengths and that makes our light better. Well, it's not just the number you have, it's also the ratio of the peaks to each other. You can throw in, for example, a bunch of the 660 nanometer red, and the more of that you throw in, it triggers hormonal responses in the plants, the shade avoidance response specifically, that causes the plants to start elongating their stems and putting more energy into their stems and growing bigger leaves. And of course, the energy they put into that is at the expense of energy they can put into their flowers. So more peaks is not always better, but yes, we do have 9 peaks for a reason. We have 8 discrete colors of LEDs for a reason. And if we could lose any one of those and still grow plants as well, we would.
And as you pointed out, there's a reason we haven't chased and changed ours a lot, like the other ones out there that are constantly trying to figure this out and maybe make a cheaper light. We have a system that works and has been proven to work, so we don't need to keep tweaking it. The one advantage we get is as technology progresses, we do get better LEDs in terms of the photon output Kevin was talking about. Electrical efficiency does increase. No one's close to the 100%, nor will they ever get there, but they are getting better and better constantly. So our lights have continued to get better just by the nature of the progression of LED development, even if we're not trying to change the ratios and the peaks that Kevin's developed for the spectrum there. And a good example is we often call it, and other people do, they often refer to it as a light recipe, right? It's a recipe. If you bake, you know that, hey, just because I use flour and water to make bread, and salt makes it better. But a bunch of salt doesn't necessarily make it better even more. So having the ratios, the right ratios, just like when you're baking or doing a lot of things, that ratio means a lot. It's like me. I used to think THC, like all of us, was kind of where you wanted to look. Now I want a higher terpene to THC ratio. Ratios mean a lot. It's not just one simple thing you can look at. Again, a single data point is kind of worthless.
And that's one thing that this study did not do. They looked at one ratio of the 640 to 660 nanometer wavelengths that they put in there, and they got a result showing that, yeah, it's better than having just one red peak in there. But in the future, they might go explore, what do we do if we change the ratio of 640 to 660? Which one works better? So even just taking this study and even just tweaking the ratio of the 640 to 660 could probably keep these researchers busy for decades, trying to figure out what's going on. And that's what makes all of this so complicated and difficult to understand. Everyone would love to be able to boil it down to, I just need a warm white or a cool white, and it's not that simple.
Nothing is simple, right? It just doesn't work out that way. So we don't want to go too much further into this because we are going to put the study up. And this is a very heady topic. It took me a minute to really read through and understand the article, the research, but I do recommend you take a look at it. It's fascinating. Even if you skip a lot of the written stuff and just spend a little time looking at the graphs and charts they provide, fascinating stuff. And I think if you're going to take your job seriously, if you're a commercial grower, these are the kinds of things you should be looking at to see what the new research, this is cutting edge stuff. People don't realize that how new LED and grow lights really are. We're one of the oldest in the world at almost 15 years. And before LED grow lights, yes, we had HPS, yes, we had metal halide, ceramic metal halide, compact fluorescent. We had some different technologies to play with, but you were stuck with those technologies. You couldn't grab a bunch of things and make a recipe, play with the peaks, and devise things like our spectrum. So these guys are doing stuff that's never been done because it just wasn't available. Technology is amazing, and LEDs can do some really fun things, and we look forward to seeing more research like this, helping to point us in even better directions in the future. So please do take a moment to check it out. Thanks again to the research group that did this. Really good stuff. We hope a lot of people read it, and we hope they put more out. It was peer-reviewed. It is a solid article, and you should check it out. So anything you want to add to this, Kevin, at all about that? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us today for another installment of Cultivation Cast. Please check back in. We have more coming your way. And again, keep those suggestions coming. We do love them. Happy gardening.